When looking towards the various tales and fables of the internet, the people, the wars, the events that shaped the culture and very nature of what the internet is today, I can't help but be drawn to the darkness. The pit, as it were, full of the odd people, interesting characters, and those whom before the invent of the internet would have hidden in the corners of society at large. But today we won't be looking at a particular person, but rather an interesting genre, a new form of storytelling in a sense that had spawned from the web, one rooted in urban legends, the evolution of technology, and even the very minds of those whom surround us. Today we'll be talking about the medium that all at once are all these things and a total laughingstock of cringe, locales, and angsty teenagers. Oh yes, and today we'll be talking about creepypastas. English professor Jan Harold Brunvand famously introduced the term urban legend to the general public in his series of popular books beginning in 1981, although the term had been used by folklorists in print since 1968. Urban legends can be described as tales, legends, anecdotes that all tell a story in a humorous and/or disturbing way, that are either spun as a true story or at the very least based upon real events. These urban legends have common themes and motifs about them, such as a storyteller saying it happened to someone they knew, or that they heard this story from a friend, as well as keeping a general sense of plausibility, with many urban legends having to do with crimes, serial killers, or events that, while crazy, could realistically happen. In fact, the famous one people know about, the killer at Lover's Lane, the hook, as it were, can be actually traced back to the Lover's Lane murders of 1946 in Texarkana, Texas. Urban legends often hide a moral at the end of them, or at the very least, play with people's normal everyday lives, like checking your back seat in your car before you start driving, or remembering that dogs aren't the only thing that can lick your hand in the dark of the night next to your bed. This too draws from its core influence in folklore, as they also reflect upon the culture and its fears, humor, lifestyles, and prejudices, all set in the modern setting of today. In the end though, all these stories only really live on through them being spread around from person to person, often changing as times themselves change, many being spread from friend to friend in an oral fashion. However, this would later become a far easier task and would come to evolve as the age of the internet came upon us. Starting in the 1990s, the urban legend would find new life through chainmail. These chainmails were a bit different from the usual urban legends, however, in one unique way, in that they utilized technology as well as the personal nature of emails to scare or trick the reader in a much more psychological sense. These chainmails often either told a crazy but somewhat believable story, like Bill Gates sharing his fortune with all those who shared this email around, or pulling on the heartstrings like the Help Save Jessica Mydick email, which told the story of a 7-year-old girl who was suffering from a rare disease and that you could help if you donated at least 3 cents and shared this email around with everyone you knew. Or perhaps the more relevant to our topic, the scary ones, like the Little Clarissa chainmail, which read as follows. Quote, "Warning, carry on reading looking or you will die, even if you only looked at the word of warning. Once there was a little girl named Clarissa. She was 10 years old and she lived in a mental hospital because she killed her mom and dad. She got so bad that she went on to kill all the staff in the hospital, so the Moore government decided that best idea was to get rid of her. So they set up a special room to kill her, as humane as possible. But it went wrong. The machine they were using went wrong, and she sat there in agony for hours until she died. Now every week on the day of her death, she returns to the person that reads this letter on a Monday night at 12 a.m. She creeps into your room and kills you slowly by cutting you and watching you bleed to death. Now send this to 10 other pictures on this one site, and she will haunt someone else who doesn't. This isn't fake. Apparently, if you copy and paste this to 10 comments in the next 10 minutes, you will have the best day of your life tomorrow. You will either get kissed or asked out. If you break this chain, you will see a little dead girl in your room tonight. In 53 minutes, someone will say, "I love you," or "I'm sorry," unquote. As I'm sure you've managed to catch on to, all these chain mails have a sort of formula, and that they play with the reader's emotions in some sense to get them to spread the word in the emails to as many people as possible. In this Clarissa's case, even playing with one's superstitions. Chainmail, while easy to spread these urban legends about, the irony is that the very tool they used to their advantage also made it all the easier to debunk them. The internet giveth and it taketh away. Overexposure also made these sort of easy to fish out, with them working most effectively on one's first encounter with them. After all, they did all follow a simple formula that was easy to catch on to, though even without the fear of not to spread the word, many still held a certain atmosphere that might unnerve the reader, especially when they included pictures and the like to enhance the storytelling. Nevertheless, these chainmails spread like wildfire for some time, becoming urban legends in of themselves, and the first signs of us using technology to scare each other. Hell, some of those chainmails straight up said you would get a virus on your computer if you didn't spread this email around. I'd even suggest that from this point going forward, the urban legend evolved into the cyber legend. Chainmail wasn't the only way urban legends found their way onto the internet, however. With the invent of image boards like that of 4chan came new opportunities to spread stuff all over the internet. Copypasta is internet slang for any block of text that gets copied and pasted over and over again, typically disseminated by individuals through online discussion forums and social networking sites. The term is thought to first be coined by 4chan Anon's community circa in 2006. The odd name comes from the action taken to create, copy-paste. These walls of text often were shared around to share stories, memes, but most importantly, scary stories. The term creepypasta is thought to have first been used among 4chan's community around mid-2007. Creepypasta, like copypasta, are blocks of text shared around forums, image boards, and the like, in this case for the singular purpose to creep out its readers, sometimes with some supplemental material, such as pictures to go along with the text. Early creepypastas were usually written anonymously and routinely reposted, making finding the exact authors and origins of these stories rather difficult to track down. However, it has been argued that Ted the Caver, a story posted on Angel Fire in 2001, was the earliest example of creepypasta on the internet. The story was written in the first person from the perspective of Ted, as he and several friends explored an increasingly frightening cave system. Beyond that, however, many of the earliest creepypastas were created in the export of 4chan 4chan, which focused on the paranormal. Many of the earliest creepypastas from this time started out as rituals, personal anecdotes, and urban legends like that of the Bunnyman, Polybius, and other such urban legends that were sort of tossed around before, until eventually the genre of copypasta started to take on a life of its own, as stories began to get more and more creative and much more disturbing. Some examples of the prime creepypasta that emerged at this time are The Rake, a story about a creature that has lived on for generation after generation, that has long claws that scrape and scratch their way along your home and floors until it comes to reach out for you. The Russian Sleep Experiment, a story about a Soviet Russia team of scientists experimenting on the psychological nature of sleep deprivation on several test subjects back in the 40s, and the dark reality that unfolds before their very eyes. While not one of my favorites, certainly one of the more influential would also be Squidward's Suicide, a supposedly lost episode of the SpongeBob SquarePants kids show in which Squidward, well, commits suicide. Candle Cove is one of the all-time best creepypastas, as it tells the tale of a group of forum users discussing a show as they have vague memories watching when they were young that terrified them, with a twist that seriously gives me goosebumps every time I read it. The Midnight Game is less a story and more instructions on how to play a dangerous game with a demon. I consider it to be one of the best ritual-based creepypastas out there, along with maybe The King's Game. It's, of course, all fake, but it's set up in such an ominous way that it really pulls you in. And then we have Smile Dog or Smile.jpg, one of my all-time personal favorite classics. This story focuses on a man looking into the mysterious nature of a picture depicting a dog smiling being spread around via chainmail that curses the viewer after seeing it until they spread the word. I could honestly go on and on with these classic creepypastas from this time, as most of them are now classic internet scary stories that are always fun to share around. Major dedicated creepypasta websites started to emerge in the late 2000s to early 2010s, with creepypasta.com being created in 2008, while the Creepypasta Wiki and the R No Sleep were both created in 2010. These websites created a permanent archive of creepypasta, which profoundly impacted the genre and made them all the easier to consume and even binge if you were so inclined. Many authors started taking inspiration from these classic stories, sometimes reusing their characters or just being inspired by them, which caused the rate of new creepypastas to shoot up in a major way. By January 2011, YouTubers like Mr. Creepypasta started to pop up, of whom would read these stories on YouTube, which again blew creepypastas up all over again, as they were now even more easy to consume. In fact, it would become a whole new genre of YouTube channels to narrate these creepypastas. As a matter of fact, that's really how I first found out about all those years ago. I suppose if you want to get technical, the first creepypasta I ever found out about was the Tails Doll Curse, which is just as stupid as it sounds. Essentially, there's this unlockable character in the game Sonic R that looks like this, and it's called Tails Doll, and according to the internet, this doll could be summoned in various ways, like beating the game as him, winning a game of hide and seek as him, or going into a pitch black bathroom, playing Can You Feel the Sunshine, or living in a city backwards. If that sounds like Bloody Mary a bit, it's because it is. But needless to say, me and my brother had barrels of fun scaring ourselves with this. As far as the official 4chan type pastas, I found those through channels like Mr. Creepypasta and Creepsmcpasta's narration. I found myself being absolutely enthralled by these stories. They had a sort of campfire setting and mood, that when you're sitting all alone in your dark room, the glow of your computer screen or phone, with a creepy picture encompassing the whole screen being the only source of light, it creates a truly creepy atmosphere that, me being me, I just couldn't get enough of. I have fond memories being awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, all alone, listening to stories like Mr. Widemouth, Normal Porn for Normal People, and various other short stories that, to share a secret with ya, actually made me create my first ever YouTube channel, specifically for reading Creepypasta. I laugh at those days a lot now. Like, I didn't realize that I didn't have to read the whole thing in one take, or that recording a shitty webcam intro with my corny-ass goth kid makeup would be a bad idea. But for that reason, I sort of have to thank Creepypastas in a way for giving me the courage to at least try making videos in some form. But of course, with all this popularity Creepypastas were getting, there wouldn't just be an influx of new fans, readers, and writers alike. It would also be the sword that would ultimately wound the genre forever after. What was once a niche bit of internet culture over the next couple years in the early 2010s would become a phenomenon that plastered itself all over the place. Soon the landscape of YouTube changed dramatically, not just over these creepypasta readers, but internet horror as a whole thrived during this time. But you see, there is one creepypasta that I think many would argue is the ultimate reason for this break in success, more so than any of the websites, creepypasta channels, or anything else. No, the creepypasta that blew up the medium into something everyone knew about was Slenderman. Slenderman, for as laughable as some may see him nowadays with all the shitty movies and overexposure in general he's had, his mark on internet culture and horror as we know it on the internet is undeniable and stupendously important. See, it all started back in 2009 when the online forum Something Awful had a Photoshop paranormal image contest, and these photos were created by Eric Knudsen along with these quotes. Quote, "We didn't want to go. We didn't want to kill them, but its persistent silence and outstretched arms horrified and comforted us at the same time." Unquote. Quote, "One of 2 recovering photographs from the Sterling City Library blaze, notable for being taken the day which 14 children vanished and for what is referred to as the Slender Man. Deformities cited as filmed effects by officials. Fire at library occurred 1 week later. Actual photograph confiscated as evidence." Unquote. From there, the mythos of the Slender Man began to expand as many found it fun to write fanfictions and lore for this entity. Something about the Slender Man, or as he was sometimes called, the Tall Man, the Thin Man, inspired many on the internet. This Lovecraftian sort of creature was, after all, anything. In a weird way, so little was known about it that anyone could create stories about the entity, short creepypasta stories that were shared around the internet, along with these photos, spreading Slenderman into a viral phenomenon. Perhaps the most influential of these stories would be the web series created on June 20th of 2009, entitled Marbled Hornets. The web series is entirely on YouTube and was created in a sort of immature, found footage format that not only expanded the lore of the Slender Man, in which they call him the Operator in the series, but also managed to create a genuinely creepy atmosphere and interesting story for the faceless Operator. But you see, our story doesn't end there. No, what really made this whole thing blow up to astronomical proportions is none other than PewDiePie. No, but seriously, Slenderman the 8 Pages, released on June 26th of 2012, is one of those games that literally shaped the face of YouTube as we know it. Actually, to be more accurate, indie horror games shaped the face of YouTube as we know it. After all, many may know PewDiePie as the king of YouTube nowadays, but before any of that, he was a Let's Player, and while he had already been getting plenty of fame from games like Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Slenderman was one of those really big hits that not only got PewDiePie way more attention, but Let's Players as a whole more attention as more and more started playing the admittingly rather simple game. And from that game spawned a plethora plethora of sequels, copy and paste Slenderman games everywhere, but also just a bunch of spin-offs and really a ton of horror indie games that without Slenderman probably would have never existed. Because in a weird way, these Let's Players were giving notoriety to these indie horror games, which in return was giving notoriety to these creepypastas, which in return fueled the fire for more creators to create more creepypastas, and indie horror games giving Let's Players more stuff to react to in their videos, and the cycle just keeps going on and on and on and on and on. While it's easy to scoff at some of these things, especially some of the maybe more cheaper indie horror games, or the cheaper creepypastas, or maybe the stuff that was just copying others, or the Let's Players that all wanted to be just like PewDiePie, it's still undeniable that this, at its core, was several creative ventures, from storytelling, video games, videos, all these things coming together in a constant flow of content that came exclusively from the internet. But the important note to take away from all this was that Slenderman was a collaborative creature created through images, stories, videos, and games. In other words, Slenderman had become the perfect urban legend creature, or as I call it, cyber legend creature, as fundamentally its creation was birthed from the wild imagination and creativity of many from various groups. This of course helped creepypastas grow into something bigger than I think anyone could have imagined. But with all these new eyes upon the medium, we finally come back to that aforementioned sword. If I were to name two things that ultimately destroyed the reputation of creepypastas, I would say overexposure and angsty teenagers. Jumping into the first one, you know what's scary? Of the unknown. The darkness that surrounds us, lives within us, and the imagination of the human mind. Do you know how to make damn near anything that was once creepy, interesting, or mysterious not all that? Seeing it all the damn time. Overexposure is something that can really kill just about anything, but for horror, it's especially bad. You know what makes Michael Myers scary in the first Halloween film? We don't know who he is as a person. We don't know his feelings. We can't understand him because he's an enigma, a shape of pure evil, with no rhyme or reason to any of the violence he causes. You know how you make him unscary? You keep making movies, you start giving him reasons, explaining who he is, giving him backstory. It can, in some contexts, be interesting, but once you know how he works, he just not that scary anymore. He becomes more pitiful, or even sympathetic, or just simply logical in some weird sense. Slenderman was the embodiment of creepypastas, a perfect shape for the collaborative work that goes into creepypastas and sharing them with others. And yet that very same thing, the thing that made it so easy to share around with everyone, so too destroyed it. Once again, the internet giveth and it taketh away. Just like the chainmail, it was spread so far that people stopped caring about them. On top of that, people felt the need to make official lore for the Slenderman. Take what was once a mystery and explain it all away. The same could be said for several creepypastas, though the bigger problem wasn't overexposure of the good creepypastas, the classics as it were, but rather the overexposure of the shitty ones. Shitty pasta, crappy pasta, just bad creepypastas, they go by many names. But stories like Jeff the Killer managed to grow just as popular as something like Slenderman. But the difference is, Jeff the Killer is a really badly written story. I mean, it's some of the worst, overdramatic, shock for the sake of shock, moronic stories that I've ever had the somewhat guilty pleasure of reading. It reads like an angry high school kid wrote it while he was grounded in his room, for God's sake. And yet, this story is how many were first introduced to creepypastas. This caused two major effects. Number one, it gave a terrible first impression for creepypastas as a whole, and two, it attracted many angsty young writers to write story after story after story about Jeff the Killer and or insert their OC, the Killer, pastas. It's almost sort of creepy in a way with how many self-insert stories about killing and or torturing their bullies and parents came out of this. It got to the point where the Creepypasta wiki had to can any story that had insert name the Killer for its title. However, this went beyond just that. Many other cringy stories like Tiki Toby, Clockwork, Your Time Is Up, and Laughing Jack and his accompanying origin story all came from this, which all followed a formula of introducing a poor teen or kid that's abused at home and that has no one who will help, who finally snaps and murders everyone, overpowering them and becoming a dark lord of evil, or a crazy serial killer that no one can catch, or maybe someone who probably works for Slenderman now and is like an unstoppable dude, man. While there continued to be great creepypastas being written, more and more of them were being crowded and hidden by poorly written copy and paste junk. And hell, Jeff the Killer isn't the only story that they did this to. There are hundreds of what you'd call lost episode creepypastas that, while sort of interesting at first, always end up being about some random kids cartoons characters dying of blood and gore and sadness. You get the picture. Or the infamous Sonic.exe that has an influence on creepypastas so great that I would need another whole video to talk about it in detail. But needless to say, insert game.exe stories were everywhere too. This caused a new problem with all those who saw all those shitty stories began to make fun of them, imitate them in the form of troll pastas, which there are so many of, they have their own fucking wiki. Adding that with the DeviantArt fetishizing of Jeff the Killer, yes, this guy having sex with other characters or their self-insert characters, along with creepypasta characters as a whole, in a similar light to that of Sonic the Hedgehog or Five Nights at Freddy's. And you have a fucking laughingstock on your hands. No one, after a while, took creepypastas seriously anymore. Many grew channels on reading just exclusively the shitty ones. And can you blame them? It's fucking hilarious. I know eventually stories like Jeff the Killer and Sonic.exe would be taken off the Creepypasta wiki, out of it bringing such a toxic fanbase to the website. Rules had to be put in place, more restrictions on what stories could and could not be posted, and a sort of iron curtain was put around the cringe that came from those stories and their fanbases that accompanied them, and what I can only assume was an attempt to distance creepypastas from that image, so that they might be taken seriously at one point again. I mean, it's not as if all the classic creepypastas were literary masterpieces. In fact, some of them still have typos and or literary issues, but none of them attracted angsty teenagers the way Jeff the Killer did, or well, the Sonic fanbase the way Sonic.exe did. On top of all that, on May 31st of 2014, an event that would be called the Slenderman stabbing scared many across the nation. But unlike creepypastas, this was real life. 12-year-olds Anissa Wiener and Morgan Geyser lured their friend Peyton Lutner into the woods and stabbed her 19 times in an attempt to impress the fictional character Slenderman. This awful event was not only evil and crazy though, but it also caught the attention of the mainstream media as fingers started being pointed and the image of creepypastas was once again tarnished. Although it should be said that many of the creepypasta community held a 24-hour live stream on YouTube on June 13th to June 14th, 2014 to raise money for the stabbing victim. Joe Jozwowski, an administrator on the Creepypasta website, said, quote, "The purpose of the stream was to show that members of the community community wanted to help the victim and to demonstrate that they were not horrible people just because they liked scary stories," unquote. And with that, creepypastas became a thing of ridicule, something the normies see as weird and possibly dangerous toward children, and something that would ultimately fall rather quiet into the shadows for some time after. Creepypastas were and always have been scary stories, and so while creepypastas fell out of favor for a while, what rose up from the ashes was true scary stories, in which the author relays a scary, usually realistic situation that they've been in. Now while a few of these may be true, most are almost certainly fake, but they are really good fake stories, and I really enjoy them. By setting the story so firmly in reality that you have to convince the reader that it really happened, it becomes much more relatable and easier to see yourself in these scary situations. However, creepypastas are still being made too, both good and bad. Creepypastas have sort of become just a label for scary stories on the internet at this point, which if you've been paying attention, you'll notice through urban legends, chainmail, creepypasta, true scary stories, web series, indie games. All of these things are really all one in the same, just scary stories being told through various formats and mediums. I think we all enjoy a good scare once in a while, and if you're someone like me, then you might even find a strange comfort in these sort of darker, scary stories, cloaking yourself in the darkness of the night. Yes, I suppose we all have our creature comforts, and creepypastas, both good and bad, are certainly one of mine. Hey there! Thank you for watching this far into the video. I hope you enjoyed this little history documentary I cooked up, and if you did, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting down below. It'll really help grow my channel. I plan on making a lot more videos like this, more documentary series within the internet fables, but also I plan on doing ones within the video game fables, history relating to video game franchises and the genre and medium as a whole, as well as film and animation fables. Basically, they're all kind of the same show, just different topics within. But until next time, this has been Dylan the Night Owl, flying off.